Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass. I'm the Director of Policy at the Franklin Center, and today I'm joined by...
I'm John Davidson. I'm a senior correspondent at the Federalist, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining me today, John. I wanted to talk to you because you've written a couple of really interesting articles for the Federalist on the topic of kind of the breakdown of low-income white culture and cultural values and the socioeconomic aspects of kind of low-income white America. And I wanted to, first off, why don't you just tell me a little bit about how you came to experience this culture, because you talked about being in a suburb of Philadelphia, and that was kind of the kicking off point, and why you think that this is an important topic for us to be talking about right now.
Sure. Yeah, for me, it actually started before I moved to Philadelphia. I was working as a newspaper reporter in Northeast Pennsylvania, and that's former coal country. A lot of really depressed towns there. I mentioned Wilkes-Barre and Hazleton, but the whole area there in the northeast part of the state was big coal country for many decades, and is really kind of a hollowed out area now. It's mostly white, very working class, and just driving through those towns and communities, you kind of it's kind of dystopian. You see shuttered factories, you see decrepit downtowns, and as a reporter, I ended up seeing a lot of crime and kind of a lot of the darker sides to these communities' decline. And that decline has been going on since since the 1970s and 1980s, and maybe even before that. So I was introduced to sort of the struggles of the white working class in a professional capacity as a reporter, as I said. But my bit more personal background for me, I did grow up in Alaska, and from a sort of a working middle class family, and there's almost Alaska's almost all white people, and there's a good number of working class kind of blue collar white folks in Alaska. A lot of people who work with their hands, who work in the trades. And so, I wasn't a stranger to sort of the pathologies of white working class culture even before I encountered it professionally as a reporter. And then, to your point about Philadelphia, it wasn't until I moved to Philadelphia from Northeast Pennsylvania and moved into the Fishtown neighborhood that I realized that the white working class struggles aren't just rural. They're not just in former coal towns or the Rust Belt, but there are, certain cities that have, white ghettos, basically. And Philadelphia is one of them. The Fishtown neighborhood, the section of it where I was living was almost entirely white, but it was afflicted with the same kinds of problems that you see in, majority black urban communities, say on the south side of Chicago. And that was when I really began grappling with this idea that, it's not a question of race so much as not that we don't have complicated issues around race in America. Of course we do, but a lot of these pathologies are blind to race, and they have a lot to do with culture and socioeconomic status and the kinds of habits that low income working class people of all races struggle with.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, because I think your Fishtown example is interesting and distinct from some other explanations of working class white culture disintegration, because, like you said, it's a little more of an urban area, it's more urban culture. How does that kind of segue off of or relate to some of the problems that we're talking about that are in these more rural areas? Because a lot of the breakdown in those places is kind of explained by, the disintegration of America's manufacturing culture and kind of the manual labor culture, and the kind of economy where people without a without even a high school education, but definitely without a college education, could still earn a decent living and raise a family. And a lot of the more rural, more suburban area breakdown has contributed to the decline in those sectors of the economy. But for a neighborhood like Fishtown in Philadelphia, it's always been running on a different kind of economy than the places in rural Kentucky or in coal country or in Ohio or places like that. So how did your experience in Fishtown, I guess, both differ and mirror some of these other problems that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good point, and these are really complicated, dynamic kind of questions, and there's no easy answer. But I will say, for example, about Fishtown, there are some of the same kind of larger economic forces at play in some of these urban areas as well. Philadelphia's economy has gone through massive changes over the past half century. Just like some of these other rural or suburban areas have gone through massive changes. The industries are different. Fishtown, as an example, Fishtown was called Fishtown because it's really close to the Delaware waterfront. A lot of the jobs in that area traditionally, going back to the middle of the 20th century, had to do with work along the river. The Delaware River is an industrial riverfront. It used to be much more of an industrial riverfront than it is now. And as the economy changed, as the riverfront changed in Philadelphia, it affected neighborhoods like Fishtown and Port Richmond, and all of those neighborhoods that sort of extend northeast from the downtown. And a lot of the economic opportunities that were there for previous generations, whether it was being longshoremen or working on the waterfront in an industrial capacity or in the manufacturing that was a big part of Philadelphia's economy and the Philadelphia area at large, a lot of those jobs went away as well. And so that same dynamic that you see in the Rust Belt or in coal country, where you could have a job that would support a family without having to have a university education, and you could support a family with a factory job or with a mining job. A similar dynamic, I think, took place in places like Philadelphia, where that changed and those jobs left, and there wasn't the same kind of economic infrastructure for people that didn't have an education to be able to support themselves. At the same time, in the 1960s and 70s, you had sort of this phenomena of white flight that happened in the late 60s, early 70s, where a lot of more affluent white families left the urban cores and settled in the suburbs. But that didn't happen everywhere, and it didn't happen in places like Fishtown and Port Richmond and Kensington in Philadelphia. A lot of the white working class families stayed, and they stayed through a period that was very difficult for a lot of these cities. A lot of these cities were massive sections of them were destroyed from riots. And these families stayed, and so they inherited a lot of the pathologies that came after that. And a lot of that was drugs, crime. Our major cities in the U.S. were not in a good state in the late 60s through the 70s and into the 80s. It's only now, you go to a place like Philadelphia or even New York, and it seems like this shining beacon of clean streets, safe streets, and young urban professionals everywhere. It wasn't that way 30 years ago. And so a lot of these white communities and neighborhoods in urban areas suffered from the pathologies that afflicted the black neighborhoods and communities in these same areas. And so there are similarities, but I think the economic forces are a bit different. But the results in terms of the problems that these communities have faced for decades now are very similar.
Yeah, that's an interesting, I think, dynamic, and I wanted to ask you about you spoke earlier of kind of the racial lens that we often view these problems through. And I've seen a lot kind of discussing how the coal country, the Rust Belt problem, is more uniquely a white problem, and there are unique factors there that are separate from the problems that we've seen for a very long time with urban poverty. And I wanted to kind of ask, where does a neighborhood like Fishtown fit into this equation? Because like you said, some of it is just that they're experiencing the same kind of urban poverty that the Black urban poverty community has been experiencing for a long, long time, and they've kind of slid into some of those similar problems, whereas the coal country, the industrial, the manufacturing communities, they're experiencing, there are a lot of statistics out there, but we saw recently that premature death of middle-aged white men has just been on the rise compared to every other demographic group in America, and a lot of it's due to drugs, a lot of it's due to suicide, and that seems to me to be more of some of the rural or suburban problems that we're talking about. How does Fishtown kind of spread that divide, I guess, between what we traditionally conceptualize as urban poverty and some of these rural and suburban and new problems that I guess we've been talking about in the last couple of years?
Yeah, in a way, I think that that the problems, I guess, the newer problems, relative to the problems I was describing in urban communities in the 70s, that had suffered from riots, the problems that we see in coal towns and in the Rust Belt with like OxyContin and other abusive pharmaceuticals, I think really started in the 1990s when physicians started using synthetic painkillers and different opioids, and they became much more prevalent and much easier to get a hold of. And I think there was not quite a recognition of how addictive these things could be. And in a way, you're seeing kind of there's an elision between the problems in these rural areas that have arisen over the past maybe 15 or 20 years, and the problems that we've seen for a long time in urban cores. The prevalence of opioids in a place like Hazleton or Wilkes-Barre is hard to convey to people who have never been there. It really is an epidemic, and it affects the entire communities, whether or not a person uses that or not. Everybody who lives there is affected by it through friends or family members, or crime, or suicide, or overdoses, and the mixing of opioid use on the one hand, and then the influx of cheap heroin on the other, has had a huge effect on those areas, so that you're starting to see over the past, as I said, 15 or 20 years, drug problems in these rural and suburban areas that are on the scale of what the drug problems were in urban areas prior to that. And there's as I said, there's a lot that goes into that. Part of that is that there's a lot more cheap heroin around, and there's a lot more cheap opioids around. You don't need a poppy field to grow OxyContin; you can just make it. And so it's sort of a perfect storm of jobs moving out, the traditional jobs that underpin some of these areas moving out, and the availability of cheap, highly addictive drugs moving in, caused sort of these pathologies to feed off of each other and become worse and worse. So to your point about how Fishtown bridges that divide, Fishtown, the problems that afflict a Fishtown or a place like Fishtown are a lot of the same problems that you see in a small city like Hazleton. and the difference is, I think there's more attention being paid to it now, but the difference between the two places, honestly, has had a lot to do with how much attention the rest of the country paid to it. For a long time, nobody paid any attention or even really knew about places like Hazleton and the problems that folks were having there. And I mentioned this in an earlier article about Pennsylvania back when they were having their primary, but Hazleton didn't make national headlines for its opioid problem. It made national headlines in 2006 when the mayor at the time, Lou Barletta, tried to pass an anti-immigration city ordinance that would have punished local businesses and landlords for employing or renting to illegal immigrants. That was what put Hazleton on the map. But what should have put Hazleton on the map was the fact that this community was collapsing under the weight of heroin and Oxycontin, and it was devastating the town. And Lou Barletta wanted to blame it on illegal immigration, but drugs are a far greater problem there. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think that it's important that we start to recognize that problems that we used to associate with inner urban cores are now the dominant problems out in these sort of outlying, forgotten areas.
Yeah, I feel like the first time that I had kind of encountered some of this writing about the disintegration of the working class white communities was with Charles Murray's Coming Apart in 2012.
Yeah.
And what I thought was really interesting, and I'm not sure if it was your latest or your second to latest article on the Federalist, was about how in Fishtown, and this makes sense to me as someone who's lived in large cities for my entire life, that it's kind of what we would call a transitioning neighborhood now, where the housing stock combined with the slowly becoming enriched young urban population has caused a little bit of hipsterization or yuppieization, and there are a little bit of young money moving in, and that kind of says to me, obviously, that it's a neighborhood in transition, and many cities experience this with some of their older neighborhoods. But I wanted to ask you, since you've obviously been reporting in eastern Pennsylvania for a long time, like you said, reported in Hazleton and Wilkes-Barre. I wanted to ask, how long has this been going on? Because if you're there, and this is just me guesstimating from your articles, in the early to mid 2000s, was it already in this kind of status of decay? Had these problems already taken root? How long has, let's say, educated elite America ignored some of these things that are going on?
Yeah. It's a good question. A long time, actually, a lot longer than I've been writing about it. When I arrived in Wilkes-Barre in 2005, 2006, it had been struggling for a long time. There was a flood in Wilkes-Barre in the early 1970s that destroyed the downtown, and in some ways, the local people there, said that the town never really recovered from that flood, but it wasn't the flood that destroyed the town. It was sort of the flood was the last nail in the coffin. These places have been struggling for a long time, at least as long. Well, I shouldn't say at least as long. Their struggle coincides with the struggles that we saw in urban centers in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia, even in New York City, as I said, in the 70s and 80s. The coal industry has been declining across the country and in these places for decades, and sort of the problems that have come with that, which is a lack of mobility, rising rates of working age men on disability, and then coupled with that, starting in the 1990s, an increase in opioids, and even more prevalent in the last 10 or 15 years, an increase of heroin in those communities. They've been struggling with it for a long time. I was shocked when I moved to Wilkes-Barre and started going to these different towns and these different communities, just at how bad it was. I had lived in Chicago, and I knew that Chicago had bad areas as well. I'd lived in other parts of the country, but I'd never lived sort of in the Rust Belt, and it was really surprising. You could tell just by driving around that these areas had been struggling with these problems for a long time. And then, of course, as I learned more about the history of the area and reported on it and talked to residents, longtime residents there, it became even more clear that these were communities that had been kind of in a state of crisis for years, for decades. But nobody would really paid attention to them. That wasn't sort of on the public's radar nationally. And it's a good thing that it is now, because we need to talk about why this is happening and what we can do about it.
Yeah, I wanted also to ask you, because what I've seen from, let's say, people who are uncharitable who come at this problem from the left, they will say that, we look at these problems, we look at drug abuse on the rise, family breakdown, values breakdown, and they say, the low-income and working-class white community has been experiencing these problems for 20 or 30 years, but why are we only paying attention to this now? Is it because it's white people experiencing this when the black community and particularly the urban black community has experienced problems of poverty and drug abuse, family breakdown, values breakdown for decades, centuries? Are there any unique circumstances why, some of these problems should be addressed, I guess, with a different approach than the way that we as a culture, we as a society, our government has addressed the problems that have afflicted the black community for so long?
Yeah, I think that that's a valid criticism from the left, to the extent that mainstream American culture, political culture, has not addressed the plight of the black urban community and the problems that they have faced. That's a valid criticism. We haven't, and I think this is sort of a colorblind problem. I got some pushback from those articles from the left of people saying, in effect, it's interesting to see conservatives apply their same ideas that they've always had about, black communities to working class white communities. The truth is, these problems are problems whether we're talking about a white community or a black community. I think that there's maybe more attention is being paid to them now because we as a country have been surprised to see things like an increase in mortality among middle age white people, men and women. I don't think that anybody expected that. When researchers kind of came out a year or a year and a half ago with this data that showed since the turn of this last century an increase in mortality. I think it was because we didn't really know what was happening out in the Hazeltons and Wilkes-Barres of America, and suddenly we had this measurement and this research showing, being able to measure in a statistically shocking way what was going on, and that these people were actually dying younger and more frequently than other groups whose mortality rates are going down. But I think, to your other point, we haven't, as a nation, addressed the plight of poor urban black communities, and part of the fault for that, I think, lies with democratic administrations that have governed some of these cities for generations. When you look at a place like Milwaukee or Baltimore or a lot of the cities where we've seen unrest recently, um, the black poor neighborhoods have been ignored, and democratic administrations in those cities have favored big business interests, stadiums, and major real estate development, and they've prioritized those things and those policies that support those kinds of projects ahead of prioritizing the poor communities that live in the city. They have kind of been ignored too. In a sense, we've been aware of them, but have done nothing. Whereas with these more rural white communities, we are just now becoming aware of them. Whether or not we do anything is an open question. But I think it's time to pay attention to all of these communities, white and black, rural and urban, and start talking about why we see the breakdown of families like we're seeing, why we see high mortality rates that we're seeing, why we're seeing sort of this drug epidemic that is getting worse, not better. And, if it takes a rise in mortality among middle-aged, working-class white people for us to take the problem seriously and start addressing the problems in urban areas as well as rural areas, then that's a good thing.
So I wanted to talk about, because you said one of the pushbacks you've gotten has been, liberals saying, oh, look, it's conservatives applying their, let's be derogatory here and say, harsh, cold-hearted logic to the poor white community in the same way that they have always to the poor black community. And that reminded me of, he's written a lot about this, but some of Kevin Williamson's articles about kind of the disintegration of working class white communities in certain parts of the country. And his solution was, a lot of these people have illogical emotional attachments to the places they grew up, and what they need to do is just move away from these dying communities, go to where there are jobs. And, not that would solve everything, but it might solve a couple things. It might employ a little more people on net nationwide. But I wanted to get your take on that kind of, these communities are dying, there's nothing we can do to help, you just need to move away and start a new life prescription, I think, that I've seen in a couple different places.
Yeah, I mean, I think Williamson, puts it in a pretty strident way, as he does. Right. That's kind of his thing, and and it's fine. He's a great writer. I think there is a lot to that. I wouldn't necessarily put it the way he does, but there's a lot to be said for the reluctance for people to get up and move and chase opportunity. I think I mentioned this in one of my pieces. Americans moving for work, or moving for opportunity, or moving for a chance to better their circumstances or better the chances for their family is that's the story of America, right? We've always been people that move around and push into new areas, and I think the difference is people are more reluctant to do that now, in part because it's easier to stay where you are. Comfort has a lot to do with that, and I think our welfare programs have enabled people to be more comfortable where they are, even if they are subsisting, at quite a low level, and not what we would call, prosperous or productive. But they are able to avoid the hard work of getting up and moving and starting a new career or starting a new life somewhere else. That is essential. Capitalism is creation and destruction, and it's always been that way. Changes in our country, economic, cultural changes, have seen the migration of people from one region to another on a constant basis, and that's part of the deal, right? That's part of the system that we have, the society that we have, and it's necessary for people to thrive, and so people have got to be willing to pursue opportunity and to improve their lot. and getting up and moving to a different state or a different part of the country is hard, and it requires discipline and perseverance, and a certain kind of grit that that a lot of people only find when they're forced to do it. Another criticism I've heard of my entire take on this is well, poor people can't afford to move. Well, I think that's selling poor people short, quite frankly. In the past, and not even in the distant past, not even in the 19th century past, but in the recent past, a lot of people moved, because they were poor and because they didn't have a lot of means, and they found a way to do it. And moving was, for some people, the only way out of poverty. I think that we sell low-income Americans short when we say, poor people, they just can't, they don't have the wherewithal to figure out how to move to another place and get a better job or pursue opportunity. That is part of what needs to happen in some of these communities. People do need to be willing to move. And to the extent that our welfare policies make people comfortable enough and dependent enough that they don't have to move, and they feel like they can sort of subsist off friends and family and subsist off disability checks and subsist off, state and federal welfare programs, that is not helping them. That's keeping them in a state of dependency that I think does lead to a certain kind of despair and does lead to increased drug use and alcohol abuse. And as we now are able to measure, suicide and higher mortality rates. So just say, go ahead.
One thing I think I would recommend to everyone who's watching this and interested in the topic is to read J.D. Vance's recent book, Hillbilly Elegy, which I read a couple weeks ago. But on this topic, I think one thing to consider in the moving to work idea is that for a lot of people in the working class and low income communities, their family structures are very different than what we conceive of as the Beaver Cleaver nuclear family. And he describes in his book both his family and other families where, you're the relative who's closest to you, who you care about the most, who make up your support system. It isn't always just your mother or your father or your sister or brothers. It could be your grandparents. It could be cousins. It could be second cousins, uncles. And the families in some of these communities are so much larger and interconnected and interdependent that I think, to me at least, the moving to work solution can seem a little difficult for a lot of families who are in these situations. And he talks about how his grandparents initially did the moving to work thing. They lived in Appalachia in Kentucky, and his grandfather moved to Ohio to work in a steel manufacturing facility. But moving from Kentucky to Ohio is a lot easier and a lot different than what we might be looking at with the modern American economy. So, moving for a 4-hour drive away is a lot different than saying to that same Ohio community that's now kind of been ravaged by the fact that there is no steel manufacturing anymore, that what you need to do is move to Arizona or Florida or Colorado, where there are jobs still available for low skill or low education people to make a living. And moving 4 hours away from your extended family that's also your support network is much different than moving, a 5-hour airplane ride away from your extended family and support network. And additional to that, I think one of the problems is that the people who are motivated to move might be the main tentpole pillar of some of these low-income or working-class families. So if your sister's relying on you for a house or for financial assistance, or your cousin or your brother or your parents, that makes it a lot harder to say, a lot of jobs have been lost. I've either lost my job or am in danger of losing my job. I'm not going to just pack up and move to Phoenix and abandon the rest of my family here. So I think it it might help, obviously, to encourage more people to move and to be less attached to some of these communities. But in a lot of cases, it might simply be impossible.
No doubt. As I said, there's no easy solution here, and it's going to be different for different families. But I would note that in a lot of cases, and I think J.D. Vance's book illustrates this really well, is that you may have a large family and an extended kind of family in one area, but those families are not always functional or all that supportive, in the sense that there's J.D. Vance's book talks a lot about the violence in his own family, and a lot of the sort of pathological kind of dependency that he experienced within that extended family. So you have families that on the one hand offer some kind of a support network and a community. On the other hand, a lot of them are highly dysfunctional, and and the best thing for some of those people to do is to get away from their family. I spoke with Scott Winship of the Manhattan Institute for one of those pieces I did, and he mentioned a lot of the problem in these communities is what you just mentioned, that the most functional, the most ambitious members of these families, not just the families, but of the communities, do move and seek opportunity elsewhere, and leaving behind the least ambitious people in that family or that community, which doesn't help that town or that community at all. Because its best and its brightest are leaving, and that's a problem. And I don't think there's any easy solution for it, other than what I've touched on before, is that part of the renewal that these areas need is a cultural renewal that starts right in the family, in individual relationships between family members. There has got to be a renaissance of family values and traditional families, and of two-parent families. Nothing is a better indicator of whether or not a child will be successful than growing up in a two-parent household. And increasingly, when you look at the demographic data, in these white working class rural areas, their rates of single parenthood, are akin to urban minority neighborhoods where this has been a problem for a long time. So I guess I'm saying that in some of these areas, the families can be, they can be a blessing and a curse. And to the extent that the most ambitious and the best and brightest of them get up and leave, the ones who are left behind are going to have to they're going to have to change their ways, and they're going to have to live differently, and live better, and stay together, and work. And absent those things, which are things that only those individual families and people control, there's nothing that the government can do to make them better. Right? The government cannot make us better. What the government can do is give us incentives not to be better, which I think is what has happened, with the Great Society programs that we've, that have been in place for 50 years now.
Sure, and I'd also recommend to read a really great national affairs essay by Eli Lehrer and Laurie Sanders. I think it's called "Moving to Work," but they outline what I think would be helpful. I'm not sure how many conservatives would agree, but basically a migration subsidy program where the government could pay you to move, and I'm not sure how much they would need to pay some members of these communities to move, but I think that mobility is really important, and this would certainly help the dynamism of the U.S. economy as a whole and some of the members of these low-income communities. And a second aspect of their proposal would be kind of, I don't remember what they call it, migration zones, where there are certain incentives for tradecraft learning, certain kinds of formal education that would be able to help some of these low-income communities that have seen industries leave, learn new skills to participate in a new economy. But that's kind of, I think, besides the point. I'm a big fan of the proposal in general and the moving to work idea, but I think that there are ideas out there that could help. Last point I wanted to talk to you about is that one of the reasons I think this has gained traction kind of in the media is that people portray Donald Trump's support as coming from a lot of these working class white communities. And I wanted to get your perspective on both, the kinds of people who are supporting Donald Trump. Are they these communities that we're talking about? And what, their kind of political engagement might be at this point.
Yeah, the big Gallup survey that came out, I guess last week or the week before, that looked at tens of thousands of people and asked them what their feelings were about Donald Trump, and collected a whole bunch of other demographic information from them. Found that most Trump supporters actually have above average incomes. They're not necessarily poor Americans, but it also found something really interesting, which was that they tend to live in areas that have low rates of intergenerational mobility, and that have that do have lower than average median incomes. So the people who are likely to support Trump aren't themselves necessarily low income, but they come from areas that are struggling with some of these things that we've been talking about. And that, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense, because these are the people who, to the extent that there are pillars of stability in these communities, it's them. But they see their towns and their communities and their families struggling all around them, and they've seen it for a long time. And I think there is a certain anger and resentment that would be most pronounced among those people, among the working people who do have above average incomes, but who do live in places like Hazleton and Wilkes-Barre. A desire to blame somebody or something on the decline and the decay of their town and their community. And I think that Donald Trump has tapped into that frustration. I don't think that the candidate himself understands or really cares all that much about these areas or the plight of these communities. But I do think that one of the things that's driving his support is just a seething frustration that my town, my community, my neighborhood has been crumbling for a long time. Nobody seems to care. I pay my taxes. I work hard. I do everything I'm supposed to do. But nobody can see me. No national political figures or political parties even see us or acknowledge what's going on here. And we're suffering, and we need somebody to notice us and speak to us and offer us some kind of explanation for what's happening. And here comes Donald Trump, who says, I see you, and I see what the problem is. And the problem is those political leaders who have been ignoring you for decades and selling you out to the Chinese and to the Mexicans, and not caring what it does to your communities. It makes sense to me why that resonates, even if the causes that Donald Trump is pinning on the plight of these communities are not the actual causes. Even if it's not the fault of China and Mexico and the globalists, it's understandable that it would resonate with people who have seen, from their perspective, precipitous decline in their neighborhoods and in their towns, and are looking for somebody to speak to it. And I think that's a lot of what's driving support for him among those people.
Yeah, and one of the anecdotes in Vance's book, actually, that I thought applied, kind of, and not to say that Vance or any of his members of his family would be Trump supporters, I don't know, but he said at one point in his childhood, his mom was married, and their family income was six figures, and this was in, the 1980s. And if you just gave someone those statistics, you'd say, oh, that family's probably doing okay. But he said, in that six-figure Ohio Rust Belt family, his parents were physically fighting. His mother was abusing drugs. Their family, and he kind of described it as a family actively breaking down. And then it did break down later. And it seems like, the coastal elites or the party elites just look at you and say, there's a two-parent household with a six-figure income. They've got no problems. We don't need to worry about them, despite a lot of these communities actively breaking down. So it might be that there are these white communities where their incomes are above average, but they're experiencing these problems that simply go unaddressed or unnoticed by our political class. And just because they might have above average incomes doesn't mean well, at least to them, it doesn't mean they should be politically ignored. And that section really spoke to me as who might these Trump supporters be. And particularly when you mentioned the mobility aspect, if you're in that kind of a house, in that kind of a community, and you might have an above average income, but you see your child struggling in school, maybe drop out of high school, maybe not get into college, maybe fall into, manual labor, low income, minimum wage labor or something. And you say, I worked my whole life. I thought we had a nice life. I thought that my children would easily do better than I have, and they're not. And that person might think it's because, the steel mill's not hiring. It's because there's no more coal mines. It's because manufacturing's gone. That kind of a person seems to me might be the above average income Donald Trump supporter.
Yeah, I absolutely. The urge to explain what's going on and to blame somebody or something for the problems that you see around you is completely understandable. And you're absolutely right too that income isn't the whole story. And partly that's that's something that's totally overlooked in Washington, where if it doesn't, they look at policymakers in Washington will look at statistics and look at income levels and not see the whole story, that even though a family may have above average income, there are other forces at work in this family or in this town that tell a very different story than than what you might think from seeing on a page that here is a two-parent household with above average income. That's not the whole story, and we know that now. But the people who live there have known that for a long time, and it's sad actually that the desire to understand what's happening to them and what's happening to their towns has led them to support a candidate who has no answers and who won't be able to address those problems because he doesn't understand their causes. I think that is not only sad and unfortunate, but it portends very troubling things for us as a nation, as a polity moving forward, when these people who are venting their frustration and their anger in supporting Donald Trump, don't see any improvement and only see things getting worse in the years ahead. I think that we're headed for some tough times and maybe a reckoning.
All right, I think that's about all the time we have for today. I will leave it there. Thanks a lot for joining me.
All right, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And I will see everyone next time on Blogging Heads.